Ms Thompson.
Thank you. Before lunch, we were talking about the meeting that you had with Mr Bayo's family on the 26th of August of 2015, at which time concerns were expressed concerning the independence and views of Dr Karch. We looked at paragraph 98 of your statement, and I wonder if we can perhaps have that up on the screen again. You say at the bottom of that paragraph, when we looked at Dr Karch in more detail, it did seem that his research was funded entirely by US military and law enforcement, which gave us cause to consider whether Dr Karch should be used by us and whether he was independent.
Yes.
What did looking at Dr Karch in more detail involve?
I can't specifically recall. I know that Mr Anwar gave us some information and we did some further researches ourselves. It may have been looking at what was available online, but I couldn't say specifically what it was that we did.
Whatever you did, it resulted in the discovery that his researches are funded by US military and law enforcement.
I think that's right, yes.
And I'm just wondering what sort of searches that revealed this information and whether those searches might have been undertaken at the outset.
There was, I think had we done those searches at the outset, we would have recovered the same material. So yes, we could have done that, but we didn't.
Okay. And at this distance, you can't specifically recall what it was that you did that revealed this information. You go on to say that this information gave you cause to consider whether Dr Karch should be used and whether he was independent. What was the upshot of those considerations?
So there was obviously something else which will no doubt take me to in relation to a newspaper article, and what I can't recall was whether, because we took a decision that we would not rely upon Dr Karch, and I can't recall whether or not we had formed a final view on that as a result of the researches, or whether that view crystallised as a result of the newspaper article, or whether we were just, if I can put it this way, some way down the road of thinking that we weren't going to, but we would see what he produced in any event. I don't recall specifically. The upshot of it was that we decided we weren't going to rely upon his evidence at that time. The timeline I'm not entirely certain of.
I might be able to help you to an extent. The meeting with the family was on the 26th of August of 2015. The comment in the Sun was on the 1st of November 2015. And by the time that you met with the family, Dr Karch had been instructed, but his report hadn't been received by you. And I'm wondering whether consideration was given after the meeting with the family and your own independent researches to simply withdrawing his instruction.
We didn't consider that from recollection. I think having instructed him, we thought that we ought to go through with that in any event, and his whatever he produced. So I understood he'd actually had, by that point, had access to some of the material and had begun considering it. So if we were going to end up in criminal proceedings, whatever he produced might not be something that we were going to rely upon, but it would be there, and as a matter of fairness, I think we should just consider doing that. So we never considered withdrawing the instructions at the time. We kept the instructions with them. As I say, we later decided that we weren't going to rely upon them, but I'm not sure if that was a decision that was taken before the Sun article, after the Sun article, or whether or not we had considered that we were unlikely to use them, and the Sun article was, if you like, the icing on the cake that prevented us from doing that.
A further letter of instruction was issued on the 8th of September to Dr Karch. Again, I don't think we need to bring it up on the screen, but he was instructed by the Lord Advocate to consider and provide expert witness opinion on the effect of cuffs and leg restraints and the rib fracture. Does that ring a bell?
That tends to suggest that we hadn't made a final decision then, and we were the final decision was made after the Sun article, just to that point.
Had the Lord Advocate been made aware of the concerns raised by the family and the products of your research at this point in time?
I think he was at the meeting where the concerns were expressed, if I recall correctly.
The meeting with the family?
The meeting with the family. I can't recall if he was made aware of what we had discovered at that point.
Let's perhaps look briefly at this further letter of instruction. It's per Code 3435B. So let's just see who has issued this letter. So it's been issued by the PERC, who were issuing at this stage the letters of instruction dated the 8th of September. Can we scroll to the bottom to see whose name is on this, please? It's been issued by the Commissioner herself. And if we return to the top of the text, in furtherance of the above, my letter of instruction dated 13 August, as you are aware, I undertake independent investigation under direction from the Lord Advocate. In furtherance of the 4 areas outlined in my letter of instruction, we've discussed these already: physiological effects of the drug, physiological effects of the sprays, physiological effect of the restraint, and the effect of all of the above in combination. I have been instructed by the Lord Advocate to ask that you consider and provide expert witness on the significance of the effect of the deceased being handcuffed and leg restraints applied, whether such restraint could have contributed to any positional asphyxiation, given the restraints continued to be applied following him becoming unresponsive and during and following resuscitation attempts, and the fracture to the deceased's rib and the most likely mechanism as to how this injury was sustained. So it appears that in the period between the family bringing concerns to your door, and not just their personal concerns, but concerns expressed by Dr. Carey, who's an eminent forensic pathologist, you then carried out your own due diligence and realised that there was a funding issue.
A question mark over his independence.
And a question mark over Dr. Karch's independence. You've explained why the instruction perhaps wasn't withdrawn, but it appears that the Crown, the Lord Advocate is referred to here, but I suppose the instructions could come from others within the Crown acting on his behalf, but the Crown have instructed 2 further questions to be asked of Dr. Karch. Were you aware that that was going on?
I can't recall, but I would have been aware. I would have been aware at the time. I recall the additional questions. So I recall that at that point where we were in our investigation, the continuing restraint and the question of positional asphyxiation were and the justification for the restraint of someone who was apparently unconscious. These were questions that we were asking, and similarly with the rib. These were questions which were exercising us at that time. I don't recall the specific letter, but it sounds as if in that timeline that I was struggling with, that we had not made up our mind not to use Dr. Karch at that point. We were maybe beginning to form views, but they were not fully formed by the sounds of it.
So there were perhaps some red flags, but you hadn't reached a...
Yes, I don't think we could have reached a conclusion standing the terms of the letter that's just been put to me.
All right. Around about this time, did anyone think to speak to Karch about the concerns that had been raised and identified?
We didn't speak to Dr. Karch about it. I'm not sure, from my recollection of what we had discovered, whether or not that would have changed our thinking or given us any new information. I think the information that we had in terms of the funding of his research and the funding all being from a particular direction was information that we had, and that was from published material that I think he was partly responsible for publishing. So we didn't speak to him, and I think we didn't speak to him because we weren't sure that he was going to tell us anything that we didn't know in relation to those that would address those concerns.
And what about his qualifications and expertise?
No, we didn't go into them any further with him.
You said earlier that you understood that he was a cardiologist with an interest in pharmacology and toxicology aspects.
That's my recollection. I would have to see the CV again to see what it said, but that's my recollection.
And certainly Kate Frame gave evidence that she understood he was a cardiac pathologist and toxicologist.
Similar.
Something similar.
Yes.
Dr. Karch provided a statement to the inquiry, and in response to quite simple questions about his qualifications and expertise, said, "I have no formal toxicology qualifications or training as a clinical toxicologist." Does that surprise you?
Standing some of the things we were asking him, yes.
Yeah. And we were also advised that he's not a forensic pathologist and has never performed an autopsy. Does that surprise you?
I'm not sure that. I don't recall whether he was a forensic pathologist. We understood he was a cardiologist, I think. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that surprises me as much. The toxicology part surprises me, because that was certainly one of the areas that we were looking for assistance with, and as I referred to in my statement, the effect of alpha PVP on was one of the areas that we were really quite concerned about.
And if you had known that he had no formal toxicology qualifications or training as a clinical toxicologist, would that have made a difference to whether or not the Crown approved his instruction?
I expect it would have.
In the event, he prepared two reports. They're both dated the 10th of September 2015. I don't think we need to look at them. Would you have seen them at the time?
Yes.
Reading them very short, he said that there was pre-existing heart disease that could have been fatal in its own right. The effect of physical restraint would have been de minimis. He dismissed positional asphyxia as junk science and described excited delirium as a disease. Did these conclusions allay or compound the concerns that you already had about his instruction?
I think they would have compounded the concerns that we had in relation to his description of excited delirium and in relation to what he was saying vis-a-vis positional asphyxiation. Regardless of the label, my understanding of the other evidence that we had and from other cases was that the position of a person was something which was significant in terms of their ability to breathe, and also in terms of resuscitation, the position of the person was crucial to that being successful. So that surprised me.
What, if anything, was done on receipt of Dr. Karch's reports, given that the content of them, his conclusions, served only to compound your existing concerns?
I think by that stage we had already begun to look at to look for other witnesses, and a number of other witnesses were subsequently identified who would supply the gaps in expertise that we were missing at that stage.
You mentioned his comment in the Sun newspaper.
Yes.
That went to print on the 1st of November. And if we can perhaps look briefly at your statement again, paragraph 101. You were shown an extract, and at the top of the second page, you say it was entirely inappropriate for a witness to comment on an ongoing investigation in the media. The place to comment was in his report. These comments, as well as the additional research that we had done, were crucial factors in the Crown deciding not to rely on Karch as a witness in the case. This took place before Crown Counsel were allocated to the case. I was not involved in the recognition process, and so I'm unaware as to how these concerns were made known to Crown Counsel at the decision-making stage. Now, we have a statement from Lord Mulholland. I don't think we need to put it on the screen, but if I might read it short. He says, I understand that Dr. Karch gave an interview to the Sun newspaper commenting on the case, which made him unsuitable to be retained as an expert instructed by the Crown. And you're nodding, were you?
Yes, that was certainly a discussion that we had.
Okay, so you were aware at the time that that was the Lord Advocate's
Yes.
view?
I'm sure we discussed it on the day that the article appeared.
Lord Mulholland goes on to say, an expert witness will provide independent assistance to the court by way of objective, unbiased opinion in relation to matters within his expertise. His interview to a newspaper was inconsistent with his duties as an independent expert.
I would agree with that.
You would agree? Okay. And if we can stay with your statement, please, and go to paragraph 104. If we can go a little further down, please. Here we see some extracts from your notebook. If we can keep going, please. You record, sorry, I think we in fact need to look at the italicised. The Lord Advocate's comments on Dr. Karch reflect our view of him at that stage. We had no intention of positively relying upon it to make a case, as our view was that his independence was compromised. Sorry, can you bear with me just a moment? His independence was compromised. It was, however, evidence in a case and could not be ignored. We could not unknow his view, and whilst we may not put a great deal of weight on it, if any, it couldn't simply be disregarded. Whilst the Crown may take the view on how we intended to use or not use the material, it would have to be disclosed and considered with the other evidence, albeit that we thought it compromised. The family would have been in no doubt that we were not going to positively rely on Karch's report in a prosecution. I understand what you're suggesting or alluding to there is that if there had been a prosecution, the Crown wouldn't have relied on this report,
Yes.
but your disclosure obligations would have required you to disclose it to the defence.
Yes, that's likely to be the case.
And so to that extent, it wasn't something that you could simply sweep under the carpet
Yes.
or put to one side.
It was there, it would had to be dealt with, but it was a question of weight, and we had decided that we would attach no weight to it. We wouldn't use it positively in a prosecution.
Can we continue on to paragraph 10C, please? I've read the narrative and analysis from the precognition, and you read them for the first time, I think, when you were provided with copies in order to prepare your statement. You didn't read them at the time because you'd moved on.
Yes, that's correct.
You say, I was not involved in the precognition and have not seen these documents before. As I noted the report from Dr. Karch as evidence, given that it seems that his report proposes contributory factors to the deaths that the other experts did not, it is entirely appropriate that it was considered in the narrative and analysis. Not to have done so would have given Crown Counsel an incomplete picture. However, given that the view that we had formed in 2015, I would have expected the concerns in relation to Karch that we had formed then to be reflected somewhere. Having not been involved in reporting the case to Crown Counsel, I am unable to say why they were not. Now, there is no discussion of his report in the analysis section of the precognition at all, but in the narrative, you may recall, there are summaries of each and every one of the reports that were instructed and lists of quite substantial passages of text and all main conclusions. You may recall that the narrative summarises Dr. Karch's report. It's not discussed, as I say, in the analysis, but nowhere in the narrative or analysis are the concerns around his independence, his funding, the results of your due diligence, or the article in the Sun recorded. Did that surprise you?
Yes, and I've said in my statement that I would have expected that to be reflected somewhere, the view that we'd taken, and I can see why it would be in there for completeness, but for completeness you would need to have given it its full context, and the full context would be the concerns that we had formed in 2015 and the view that we'd taken in 2015. That would have to be there as well, so Crown Counsel should have been aware of that.
And what consequences can potentially follow where a report is narrated in a narrative or analysis but not put in its proper context?
It's possible that the interpretation of it by Crown Counsel may, Crown Council may form a view based upon incomplete information and therefore interpret it in a way that that was inconsistent with our previous views that led us to put a witness before a court that was not appropriately qualified or was not appropriately independent.
I wonder if we can bring up the statement of James Wolfe, who was also Lord Advocate during the
Yes.
period of this investigation. It's SBPI 00529. And can we look at paragraph 53, please? If we can perhaps scroll a little bit so we can see the question that sits above it. He was asked the question, were you aware of any issues relating to Dr. Stephen Karch that were apparent from a time prior to your involvement in the investigation? Were you aware of Mr. Bayo's family's views of Dr. Karch? Were you aware of any media statements attributed to Dr. Karch? What were the previous Lord Advocate's views of Dr. Karch as far as you were aware? How, if at all, did any of these matters affect your understanding of Dr. Karch and his opinion? And Mr. Wolfe's reply is, I have no recollection of the issues referred to in this question. If they were drawn to my attention, I would expect that to be apparent from the documentary record. So here we have the second Lord Advocate involved in the case,
Yes.
being asked a question some years down the line, but seemingly having no recollection of there being an issue with Karch at all. And I'm wondering whether another reason perhaps to include concerns about an expert within the body of the precognition, whether in the narrative or the analysis, might be because Crown Office works in such a way that there are, from time to time, restructures, as you have described, post holders change, people come and go, and indeed during the course of this inquiry, one Lord Advocate left and another replaced him, and whether having concerns of this type recorded in the precognition would ensure that those concerns were brought to the attention of anyone involved in the case at a later stage who might not have been aware of what was going on at the time.
I would say that the principal reason for having it in the analysis was for the benefit of the marking advocate depute, but it would also serve the purpose that you suggest. It would ensure that there was complete clarity about the audit trail of the view that had been taken in 2015.
Thank you. Can you bear with me just a moment, please? I have no further questions for you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
McGowan.
Are there any Rule 9 applications, Ms Mitchell? Mr McGowan, would you mind withdrawing to the witness room while I hear a submission?
The second was, as we will recall, Mr Brown in his evidence indicated that at the time Fiona Carnan had written her analysis, he had read a mixture of some of the police and civilian witnesses' evidence, and it's not clear indeed that he had read them all. This witness said, when he was asked about scrutiny of the evidence and who within CAAPD was responsible for scrutinising it, he said to the question, would that include the precognosers? He said it would include precognosers, it would include Les Brown as the head of CAAPD, it would also include me in terms of what I read in the reports that I read. Now, what I would like to ask this witness is, did he read all the statements, including the police statements? And if he did so, why it was that he did not pick up on these issues of race? And I say that because he said that he was confident that his staff would have been able to pick up on issues of race. The third question is in relation to training. And in the statement that we have from the Lord Advocate at the time, this witness was involved at the start, Lord Mulholland. He gives an indication that following the Jandu report, all staff were trained in diversity and discrimination, including racism and religious bigotry. A steering group was set up to ensure policies and procedures were implemented. Staff were trained to ensure the issues relative to diversity and racism were dealt with at the highest level, and groups were set up reporting to steering groups on local issues. He also said all new staff had to undergo the training within 6 months to a year of taking post. And what I would like to ask him is, given his evidence about the way in which the issue of race was dealt with by CAAPD, did he consider that the training, such as it was sufficient, such that Ms. Carnan did not seem to pick up on various issues of race, and the newer staff would have been recently trained in this, and again, their input doesn't seem to have had an effect on race being included. Finally, also in relation to race, when this witness was asked how confident he was that the team had the necessary skill set to identify the evidence of racial motivation, he responded that he had every reason to be confident because they were experienced lawyers who'd been involved in large and complex cases before. However, he doesn't then go on to explain anything in relation to race. And what I would like to ask this witness was, when the people were specifically chosen for this role, was any consideration given specifically to the issue of race, and or whether someone ought to be identified, even for example out with the organisation, to bring assistance in that regard to Crown Office?
Thank you. Would you rise for a period to consider these submissions? I shall allow Ms Mitchell to examine this witness on the second issue relating to whether the witness himself had read statements and what he took from them, and on the third issue in relation to training and the evidence of Frank Mulholland about that. I consider that I would not be assisted by further examination of the first and fourth issues. So can we have the witness back, please? Mr McGowan, Ms Mitchell, who is the Senior Counsel for the families of Sheku Bayo, has some questions for you.
Thank you.
Ms Mitchell.
I'd like to ask you a question in relation to the statements, both civilian and police statements in this case. When Mr Brown had evidence taken from him, I asked whether or not by the time of the Crown analysis had been brought together, had he read the civilian and the police statements? And he said that he couldn't remember what he'd read entirely. He went on to say that he'd read a mixture of police and civilian statements. Earlier, when you gave evidence, when asked about scrutiny of evidence, you said you were asked, and who within CAAPD was responsible for scrutinising the evidence in the way that you've described it and assessing in relation to the question of racial motivation. And you were asked about precognosers, and you said it would include precognosers, it would include Les Brown as the head of CAAPD, and it would also include me in terms of what I read in the reports that I read. Now, what I want to ask you is, you've indicated that you've read reports. Did you read the police and the civilian statements?
When I referred to me reading the statements, that was at the stage of what has become known as the interim report. That was at that stage. I do not think that I read every statement on when the final report was submitted. I certainly read them all at that initial stage, and then come the final precognition, which would have contained those statements plus the precognition statements we'd taken. I wasn't involved, so I didn't read them.
So at the time of what we're calling the initial report,
yes,
or interim report, you'd read all the police statements and all the civilian statements?
Yes, my recollection is that it came in a number of folders and I read all of the material in there.
When you read in particular the police statements, did you form a view on, for example, language that could be considered racial in nature? Did anything? I
don't recall that at the time.
Do you mean that you don't recall whether you did or you didn't, or you don't recall seeing anything that would have caused
I don't
concern?
recall whether I did or I didn't.
When you saw that there was a question in relation to terrorism, did you at that time consider anything in relation to race?
The question of terrorism I was aware of on the 3rd of May, and I formed the view at that stage that, perhaps wrongly, but I formed the view that it was unlikely that there was a terrorist incident in Kirkcaldy, and I came to form the view that it was unlikely that that would have been said had the deceased been white.
So when you looked at the statements, having formed that view really from the off on the very first day, when you looked at the police statements and you'd already formed the view that you thought it unlikely they would have said that had the witness been white, what did you think then when you saw the police statements saying that?
The same thing, that that it would have been unlikely that that would have been said whether it was white, and I questioned some of that.
When you say you questioned it, who did you question it with?
Whether it was in my own mind or whether I discussed it with Mr Brown, I can't recall. But certainly that was something that was in my mind at the time when I approached the statements and was reading them.
Ought you to have raised it formally with someone if it's only a recollection from your own mind?
Raised what I
Raised
thought about.
What you thought about what was in the police statements. What I'm looking for here is, you say it's a black man in custody, it's obvious
Yes.
that race is going to be at the centre of it. You're then presented with statements which may use language which could be considered racial, use of the word coloured, and you're also given statements which talk about a link between what the police thought and the fact that Mr. Bio was black, and you're in immediate assessment of that. And what I'm trying to ascertain is, once that happened, what did you do with it? Where did you go with that, you having ascertained this link?
So that was all to my mind. That was all subject to inquiry, and we would pursue that further. I think that the whole question of terrorism was a question that we did discuss. Myself and Les Brown. I'm not sure if the Lord Advocate became involved in some of those discussions later on, but certainly Les and I had discussed that.
And by the Lord Advocate, do you mean Mr. Wolfe?
No, that at that time, because the time I'm talking about is 2015, 2016, that'd be Frank
Mr.
Mulholland at the time. So there was certainly discussion about that linkage, or that possible linkage having been made. At the same time, when we were asking questions about that, we were being told of a general warning that had been given, I think it was some time before, of a general measures that police officers should be taking, because there was a general fear that police officers may be subject to a terrorist attack of some kind, and they were doing various things to protect police officers round and about that. So
but that wasn't in connection with anyone's race.
No, it wasn't. So bottoming out whether there was an assumption on the part of the officers that because Mr. Bayou was black, it might be terrorist related, and whether that was a trope or an assumption, or whether or not their view was informed by this general warning, was something which, to my mind, had to be bottomed out during the course of the inquiry, because that would be something which assisted us in determining whether or not the force which was used was justifiable.
And did you ever come to see it being bottomed out?
I had left the case by that point, so by the time that was finally, or my anticipation would be that would be covered in the final analysis, and we've heard evidence about that earlier on. So
when you handed that
didn't.
over, did you flag up these concerns with anyone so that they'd be aware to look for it in the final analysis?
No, I didn't flag that up. I don't think I thought I needed to flag up, because I'd discussed it with others in the team.
What about, you've mentioned the issue of racist tropes. When you read the statements, were you concerned about the fact that there were possible racist tropes being used?
I can't recall if there were, beyond the terrorism link, if there were racist tropes within there.
Well, for example, the strength of Mr. Bio, the size of Mr. Bio, did any of that concern you in relation to the question of race?
All of that generally concerned me for the purposes of race and otherwise. It appeared that there was lots of use of phrases like superhuman strength, and I thought that was fundamentally unhelpful, and we needed to get to the bottom of that.
And did you express that view to anybody?
I certainly expressed the view that we needed to get to the bottom of the superhuman strength issue, and how that was, how the use of phraseology like that was fundamentally unhelpful.
Why did you think it was fundamentally unhelpful?
We were looking for an evidence-based analysis of a case, and superhuman strength is evidentially a meaningless phrase in that sense. I'm not sure at the time I considered that to be a trope. but I thought that it was we had to get to the bottom of what people were meaning in relation to that.
And what about the size of Mr. Bio? One of the police officers said something to the effect of this was the biggest man they'd ever seen.
I think fairly early on, as a matter of fact, we knew he wasn't the biggest man they would ever. I think most of the police officers were in fact taller.
And did that give you any concerns in relation to the issue of race?
It gave me concerns, but I'm not sure if it was specifically in relation to race. It gave me concerns about the accuracy and reliability of the accounts, and potentially the credibility of the accounts that we had.
Would it have been helpful if you had these concerns, particularly if you had these concerns when reading it in relation to race, or you had these concerns in relation to the other matters, if you had written down that and communicated that formally with somebody, be it to Les Brown, to someone senior to you, or directly to Park?
It would have meant that we had a proper audit trail of it, I accept. As I say, I think I did discuss it with Les Brown, who was directly involved at the time. I think these were conversations that we had.
Specifically in relation to terrorism?
I think we had the conversation in relation to terrorism, we had the conversation in relation to size, we had the conversation in relation to superhuman strength. All of these were conversations that we had.
And the latter two weren't connected with race?
I don't think I connected them with race at that point in time, no.
Would you connect them with race now?
It's possible that they could be connected with race. I didn't see it that way at the time. I say at the time I took them to be indications that the material that we had from the police, there were doubts over its reliability and its credibility.
I'll move on to my next question. Following on from the Choker case, we understand from the evidence and statement form that's been given by Lord Mulholland that the Crown embarked on a systematic review of all its policies and procedures to ensure it wasn't institutionally racist. Presumably you, having been in Crown Office that length of time, were aware of that.
I was. That was very early on in my career. At that time, I'd have been a fiscal deputy at Hamilton. So I was never involved in the process, but I was aware that that process was ongoing, and new policies and amendments to policies training was coming out at that time.
Yeah, it says all staff, new and existing, were trained on diversity and discrimination.
There was
as
a 2-day course I recall being on.
Including racism and religious bigotry.
Yes.
And it says that a steering group was set up to ensure that such policies and procedures were implemented. Staff, including all ADs, were trained to ensure that issues relative to diversity and racism were dealt with at the highest level. And area groups were set up reporting to the steering group on local issues.
Yes.
So you had a top to bottom, as it were. The idea was there was going to be a top to bottom review. You have heard about the way that the evidence has been dealt with by, for example,
yes.
Fiona Carnan, Mr. Brown. Given your view about the way in which the evidence was dealt with, does it suggest that the training which was put in place at the time for Ms. Carnan, who would have been there
yes.
for the training in her 30 years, and for the new members of staff who have to undergo training when they arrive, isn't fit for purpose?
It certainly suggests that there is a need to review and refresh that training. There are elements of training in relation to race, I think, for new starts. I can say exactly what they are, but it certainly sounds as if all of that needs to be reviewed and refreshed. Absolutely.
Would you find benefit in that?
I think I would, yes.
Thank you. Mr. McGowan, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm very grateful for your time. We're about to rise for the day and you'll then be free to go.
Thank you.
So we'll adjourn now until Monday at 10 o'clock, next Monday. Slight change of the usual routine, so we're sitting on a Monday.